There are moments in history that no one plans for. Moments that arrive without warning, like a cold wind through an open door, and suddenly, everything changes. The flowers appear first, then the candles, then the people, hundreds, then thousands, standing in silence, holding photographs of someone they never personally knew but somehow loved deeply. Grief is strange that way. It does not ask for permission. It does not care whether you knew the person or not. It simply arrives, and it demands to be felt. Britain has known this kind of grief before, but what happened in the weeks and months following certain national tragedies revealed something remarkable. Not just about a mourning nation, but about two people who chose to step into that grief rather than stand at a safe distance from it. This is a story about William and Catherine, about what it truly means to show up, about a quiet kind of courage that does not wear armor, but instead wears a warm hand on a trembling shoulder. It was not supposed to be a working day. The schedule had been cleared. The palace had been careful to manage the diary, to protect what little private space remained for the Prince and Princess of Wales. But early that morning, the reports had begun coming in. A tragedy had unfolded in a small town. A community was shattered, and by mid-morning, a decision had been made. Not by an advisor, not by a communications team, but by William and Catherine themselves. They were going. This was not unusual for them, but it was never something that could be taken for granted. The pull toward comfort, toward visibility, toward action that had been built over years. Years of learning what the role truly required. Years of watching and listening and sometimes getting it wrong and correcting course. But on this particular morning, there was no hesitation. Catherine was already reading through the briefing notes. William had already spoken to the local authorities. They were going because they felt they should, and because, as those close to them would later say, there was simply no question in their minds about whether it was the right thing to do. The journey itself was quiet. There was no fanfare, no large convoy of vehicles. A small team traveled with them. A private secretary, a protection officer, a member of staff whose sole job was to ensure that the people they were about to meet felt comfortable and not overwhelmed. Catherine had asked specifically that the visit feel as informal as possible. She did not want barriers. She did not want the kind of royal visit where people stood in neat lines and made polite conversation because they felt they had to. She wanted something real. She wanted to look people in the eye. When they arrived, the community was still in the raw, early stage of grief. The kind where nothing feels real yet. Where people are moving through the hours in a kind of fog, doing what needs to be done, organizing, contacting, arranging, because the alternative is to stop and feel the full weight of what has happened. And that weight is simply too heavy to carry standing still. The streets had that particular hush that descends on a place after something terrible has occurred. Even the air felt different. Heavier somehow. A small group of local officials greeted them at the edge of the community center. There was a brief, formal exchange, handshakes, low voices, a few words about what had happened and what the community needed. But Catherine was already looking past the officials toward the people gathered inside. She could see them through the glass doors. Families sitting in clusters. Children who did not fully understand. Elderly people staring at nothing in particular. A woman near the window whose hands were folded in her lap, so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. William noticed her too. They went inside. What happened over the next several hours was not captured fully by any camera. The official photographs showed what they always show, two public figures moving through a space, speaking to people, listening. But the photographs could not capture the texture of those conversations. They could not show the way Catherine sat down next to a woman who had not spoken to anyone all morning and simply stayed there, did not immediately ask questions, did not offer rehearsed words of sympathy, just sat, waited, let the silence do what silence sometimes needs to do before words can come. The woman's name was Margaret. She was in her 60s, a retired school teacher, and she had lost her neighbor of 32 years in the tragedy. Not a family member. Not a spouse, a neighbor, someone who had knocked on her door every Tuesday morning with a small portion of whatever she had baked that week. Someone who had sat with her when her husband was ill. Someone who had, in all the quiet ways that matter most, been a constant presence in the architecture of her daily life. And now that presence was gone, and no one seemed to understand why that was so devastating, because the word neighbor did not carry the weight of what she had actually lost. Catherine understood, or rather, she listened until she understood. She asked Margaret about the Tuesday baking. She asked what her neighbor's specialty had been, and Margaret slowly began to talk. She talked about lemon cake. She talked about the way her neighbor always wrapped it in a piece of blue cloth. She talked about the blue cloth for a long time, and Catherine listened to every word as though there was nothing else in the world she needed to be doing, as though the lemon cake and the blue cloth were the most important things she had heard all year. Across the room, William was with a group of men who were struggling in the way that men in crisis often struggle, with the expectation that they should be strong, that they should be managing things, that their job was to hold others together rather than to fall apart themselves. He had been told about this group before arriving. He had been told that they were exhausted and that no one had really asked how they were doing, because they looked like the ones who were coping. He pulled up a chair and sat among them, not across from them. A small thing, but it mattered. He told them that coping and feeling fine were not the same thing. He said it without fanfare, without a speech. He said it the way someone says something true, quietly, and without needing to be thanked for it. One of the men, a broad-shouldered builder in his 40s named Derek, looked at William for a long moment after he said it. Then he nodded. Then he looked down at the floor. Then, after a while, he began to speak. He spoke about the night of the tragedy, about what he had seen, about the sounds he still heard when he closed his eyes. William did not flinch. He did not look away. He held the weight of what Derek was sharing with both hands, the way you hold something fragile, and he stayed with it. This was the thing about William and Catherine that was difficult to explain to people who had not witnessed it firsthand. It was not simply that they were kind. Kindness was common enough. It was that they were present. Fully, completely present. There was no part of them that was already thinking about the next engagement, the next meeting, the next conversation. When they were with someone, they were entirely with that person. And for people who were used to being overlooked, people who felt that the world had moved on too quickly from their pain, that the news cycle had already forgotten what had happened to them, that presence was extraordinary. It felt, to many of them, like being seen for the first time in a very long time. The children were a different matter. There were several of them in the community center, brought there by parents who did not know where else to go, and felt that being around others was better than being alone at home. The children ranged in age from perhaps 4 to about 12, and they moved through the space in the way children do when they sense that something serious is happening but cannot fully process it, with bursts of energy followed by sudden stillness, with laughter that appeared unexpectedly and then disappeared just as fast. Catherine moved toward them naturally. There was no instruction, no protocol. She simply gravitated toward the children the way she always did, because children responded to her in a way that adults sometimes did not, without the layer of formality, without the self-consciousness, without the awareness that they were supposed to be behaving in a particular way. A small girl in a yellow coat approached her directly and asked, without any preamble, whether she had a dog. Catherine smiled and said that she did. The girl asked what the dog's name was. Catherine told her. The girl considered this seriously and said that it was a good name. And somehow, in that small exchange about a dog's name, something loosened in the room. A few people nearby who had been sitting in tense silence looked up. Someone smiled. It was the first genuine smile that had crossed the room all morning. William, watching from a few feet away, caught Catherine's eye. A look passed between them, brief, quiet, warm, the kind of look that belongs only to two people who have been through enough together to communicate in a language beyond words. The day was long, much longer than the official schedule had suggested. They stayed well past the time they had been advised to leave. At one point, a member of the team approached William quietly and mentioned that they needed to begin thinking about departure. William thanked him and said they would be a little while longer. He said it without any drama, without any sense of performing generosity. He said it the way a person says something when they simply are not ready to leave yet, because the work is not finished. And The work in this case was not the kind of work that appeared on any official document. It was not measurable. It did not produce any output that could be reviewed or assessed. It was simply the work of being human in a room full of people who needed to feel that humanity, and it was some of the most important work that either of them would do that year. By the time they finally prepared to leave, the atmosphere in the community center had changed. Not dramatically. The grief was still there. It would be there for a long time. But something had shifted. Margaret was talking to another woman across the table, telling her about the lemon cake, and the other woman was nodding and adding her own story. Derek was standing with the other men, and though none of them were saying very much, they were standing closer together than they had been before. The small girl in the yellow coat was asleep on a chair, one arm around a stuffed bear, looking as peaceful as only sleeping children can look in the middle of chaos. At the door, one of the community organizers, a tired, red-eyed woman who had been managing the response effort for 3 days straight, reached for Catherine's hand and held it for a moment. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Catherine held her hand back, and they stood there together for a few seconds, and that was enough. On the drive back, William and Catherine were quiet for a long time. The countryside moved past the windows. The light was changing. Neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with talk, because some days end in a kind of stillness that is not emptiness, but fullness, the fullness of having given everything you had to give and knowing, even without any evidence you could point to, that it had mattered. It had mattered to Margaret. It had mattered to Derek. It had mattered to the woman at the door, and to the small girl in the yellow coat, and to dozens of others whose names they would not remember, but whose faces, for a long time afterward, they would not forget. That is the thing about compassion. It does not keep records. It does not ask for receipts. It simply moves through the world, touching what it touches, and leaves behind it something that cannot be seen, but can absolutely be felt. A warmth, a reassurance, a quiet but unshakable message that says, you are not alone in this. Someone came. Someone stayed. Someone listened. And on that particular day, in that particular community, the someone was William and Catherine. The news did not spread the way royal news usually spreads, with fanfare and official statements and carefully managed press releases. It spread the way the truest things always spread, quietly from one person to another, in the language of personal testimony. A woman who had been at the community center told her sister. Her sister told a friend. The friend posted something online, not a big dramatic post, just a few sentences describing what she had heard, and within hours, thousands of people were reading it. By the following morning, it had been shared across the world. What struck people most reading that account, and the many others that followed, was not the fact that William and Catherine had visited. Royal visits happened regularly. They were documented and photographed and reported on. What struck people was the specific detail of how they had visited. The detail about Catherine sitting in silence before speaking. The detail about William pulling his chair among the men rather than across from them. The small, deliberate choices that together formed something larger than any one gesture could carry alone. People recognize something in those details. They recognize the difference between going through the motions of compassion and actually practicing it. And that difference, in a world where the difference had become harder and harder to find, hit something deep. The response surprised even those closest to William and Catherine. Letters arrived at Kensington Palace in greater numbers than usual. Not the formal letters of appreciation that were part of the regular correspondence, but personal letters. Handwritten letters from people who want to share their own stories of grief, their own experiences of feeling invisible in the middle of loss, their own moments of unexpected kindness from strangers that had changed something inside them. One letter from a woman in her 70s who had lost her husband of 50 years said simply, I don't know them, and they don't know me, but knowing that people like that exist makes the world feel safer. She had underlined the last 4 words. Catherine read the letters personally. This was not unusual. She had always maintained a commitment to reading the correspondence herself, at least a portion of it, because she felt it was important to remain connected to the reality of what people were experiencing. But The volume in the weeks following the community visit was extraordinary. She spent several evenings sitting with the letters, reading through them carefully, sometimes pausing over a particular sentence or phrase. Her private secretary noted later that she had responded to a number of them in her own handwriting. Again, not unusual, but notable given how many there were. What the letters also revealed was something that William and Catherine had long known, but that the public was only beginning to fully see. That grief was everywhere, and most of it was silent. The kind of grief that did not make headlines. The grief of ordinary loss, of neighbors, of routines, of the small certainties that hold a life together. People wrote about their parents, about friends they had drifted away from, about communities that had changed beyond recognition, about the particular loneliness of living in a world that moved very fast and did not always leave room for the slower, heavier work of mourning. And in all of these letters and all of these different stories, there was a common thread, the feeling of being unseen, of carrying something that no one else seemed to notice or want to carry with them. William and Catherine had spent years developing an understanding of this. It had not come naturally or easily. Both of them carried their own experiences of grief, profound, public, incompletely understood. William had grown up with a grief that the whole world had watched, but that he had had to navigate largely alone in the strange paradox of being simultaneously the most observed person in any room and the most privately isolated. He had spoken about this openly over the years, with a candor that had not always come easily, but that he had come to understand was part of his responsibility. Not to perform vulnerability, but to be honest about it. To name the thing that so many people were experiencing, but struggling to give language to. Catherine, too, had come to her understanding of grief through her own path. She was not by nature someone who wore her feelings on the surface. She was composed, careful, thoughtful in the way she revealed herself. But beneath that composure was a deep emotional intelligence, an ability to read a room, to sense what was unspoken, to move toward the thing that needed attention rather than away from it. People who worked closely with her often described this quality as her greatest gift. Not her looks, not her poise, not her ability to manage a public schedule with grace, though she had all of those things, but her instinct for the human moment, her ability to find it and to honor it. Together, they formed something complementary. William brought a directness, an earnestness, a willingness to name difficult things plainly. Catherine brought a quietness, a patience, a capacity to create space. When they were working together in a room, those qualities amplified each other. People who might have been too reserved to speak to William alone would find themselves opened up by Catherine's presence. People who might have become lost in emotion with Catherine would find themselves steadied by William's calm clarity. It was not something they had consciously designed. It had evolved over many years, through many different rooms in many different places. In the weeks that followed the community visit, there were more visits. This was partly because the schedule demanded it. There were commitments that had been arranged long in advance, events and engagements that could not be moved. But some of the additional visits were unscheduled, quietly arranged, without press announcements, without advance notice to anyone except those directly involved. A hospice in the north of England, a center for families dealing with addiction, a school in a community that had experienced significant violence and was trying to rebuild. These were not the kind of visits that generated large amounts of coverage. They were chosen for different reasons. At the hospice, William spent time with a group of healthcare workers who had been working through a period of exceptional difficulty. It had been a hard year. There had been staff shortages, emotional burnout, the particular weight that comes from working in a place where people come to die and where the standard of care must somehow remain constant despite everything. The manager of the hospice had been quietly concerned about her team's well-being for months. She had not expected a royal visit to be part of the solution. She had not, in truth, expected a royal visit at all. But when the call came and she was told that William wanted to come specifically to speak to the staff, she had said yes immediately. What happened at the hospice was, in many ways, similar to what had happened at the community center. There was no formal program. William sat with small groups of staff in a break room, drank tea from a paper cup, and asked them about their work. He asked not the broad, policy-level questions that might be expected, questions about funding or resources or government support, but specific questions about individual patients they had cared for, about what had been hardest, about what still felt meaningful even on the most exhausting days. One nurse told him about a patient who had asked her, in his final days, to teach him how to whistle. She had tried her best, she said, and he had never quite managed it, but he had laughed every time he tried, and the laughing had been enough. William listened to this story and then was quiet for a moment. He said, "That's the kind of thing people carry with them forever." The nurse looked at him and said, "Yes. Yes, it is." Catherine, meanwhile, was with a different group at the hospice. Families who had recently lost loved ones there, who had gathered in one of the reception rooms for a remembrance session. She had been briefed that the families were at different stages of grief, some still very raw, others further along, and that the dynamic of the group could be unpredictable. She had listened to the briefing carefully. Then she had gone in. The session was not structured. There was no agenda. Catherine moved around the room, speaking to each family in turn, with no fixed amount of time at each conversation. Some conversations were brief. Some were long. One conversation lasted nearly 40 minutes, with a father and his teenage daughter who had lost their wife and mother 3 months earlier. The daughter had barely spoken since the loss. She sat beside her father in silence, arms crossed, chin slightly down, the posture of someone who has decided that speaking is too great a risk. Catherine sat across from them and spoke mostly to the father at first, asking gentle questions, not pushing. And then, at some point, she turned to the daughter and said softly that she looked like someone who was very good at taking care of other people. The daughter looked up. That was all, just a look up. But the father later said that it was the first time in 3 months that he had seen his daughter look directly at another person. The hospice manager wrote to Catherine afterward. She wrote that the visit had done something for her team that months of meetings and wellness initiatives had not been able to do. It had reminded them that what they did mattered. Not in the abstract way that it was easy to say and harder to feel, but in the specific, immediate, personal way that only comes when someone sits with you and pays attention to the actual details of your actual work. She wrote, "You gave them back to themselves." Catherine kept that letter. She kept a number of the letters from that period in a folder in her private study, not as trophies, not as records of achievement, but as reminders of what the work was for, reminders of what it felt like to be in those rooms, with those people, doing the thing that was simple in theory and difficult in practice and necessary in every possible sense. There was a conversation during that period, not public, not reported at the time, that those close to the family would later describe as having been significant. William and Catherine were traveling back from one of the unscheduled visits, and William said something that he had been thinking about for a while. He said that he sometimes worried whether what they did was enough, whether showing up and listening and staying present made a real difference, or whether it was, in the end, a gesture meaningful to the individuals involved, but not large enough to change the underlying conditions that created so much grief in the first place. Catherine had been quiet for a moment. Then, she had said that she thought he was asking the wrong question. Not the wrong kind of question, it was a good kind of question to ask, and he should always keep asking it. But wrong in one specific way. She said that changing underlying conditions was important, and that they should keep working toward it. But a gesture that made a single person feel seen, and not alone, that was not a small thing. That was, in fact, the whole thing. Because every person who felt seen carried that feeling outward. It moved through them into their relationships, their communities, their own capacity to show up for others. She said, "We're not dropping stones into a lake. We're dropping stones into people. And people are not still water. They move." William had looked at her for a long moment. Then he had nodded. Then he had looked back out the window, and they had ridden the rest of the way home in the comfortable silence that had always been one of the most reliable features of their life together. The world outside continued its business. News cycles turned. Other events competed for attention. But in a hospice break room in the north of England, a nurse was carrying a story about a man who had tried to learn to whistle. And in a living room somewhere, a teenager who had not looked up in 3 months was sitting with her father, and though things were not fixed, they would never be fully fixed. Something had shifted, and the shift had direction. These were not the stories that appeared in the papers the following morning. They did not need to. They were already doing their work. There's a particular kind of cold that settles over a nation in collective mourning. It is not the cold of weather or season. It is the cold of shared absence, the feeling that something has been taken from the common air, that the world has a shape it did not have before, and that shape includes a missing piece. Britain had known that cold before. It had known it through wars and disasters, through the deaths of leaders and the failures of institutions, through moments when the gap between what people were told and what they could feel with their own hands became impossible to ignore. But it had also known, in those same moments, the warmth that arrived when someone chose to step into the cold alongside those who were suffering. History remembered those moments, not always with monuments or speeches, often simply with the testimony of ordinary people who said, "Someone came. Someone did not look away." What William and Catherine had been doing throughout the preceding months was, in one sense, not new. It was the continuation of a tradition, the role of the monarchy as a source of national comfort, and continuity, the expectation that in times of crisis the family would be visible, present, and human. But there was something in the way they were doing it that felt different from what had come before. And as the winter of that year deepened and the national mood grew heavy with grief of a different and more complex kind, that difference became increasingly important. The grief that descended that winter was not attached to a single event. It was diffuse, accumulated, difficult to name. There had been a series of losses, community tragedies, institutional failures, the quiet deaths of things that had once held people together. There was a mood of exhaustion in the country that went beyond the political and the economic. It was something more like spiritual tiredness, a fatigue with loss itself, a feeling that the reserves that allowed people to absorb hardship and keep moving were running lower than they had been in a long time. Commentators wrote about it. Therapists and community workers talked about it. People in pubs and on buses felt it, though they used different words or no words at all, just a heaviness in the body, a reluctance in the morning. It was into this atmosphere that William and Catherine brought their most sustained and deliberate period of public engagement. They had been advised by some to be careful. The advice was well-intentioned. There was concern that overexposure could diminish impact, that if they appeared everywhere, they risked becoming part of the ambient noise rather than a distinct signal. It was reasonable advice, and they considered it carefully. But they also trusted something else, their own reading of what the moment required. And what it required, they felt, was not measured presence. What it required was simply being there. They were there in a coastal town that had been devastated by flooding, sitting in a church hall that still smelled of damp, and listening to elderly residents describe watching their homes fill with water. They were there in a Midland city where a factory closure had left an entire neighborhood economically stranded, speaking not to the politicians or the economists, but to the workers, people whose identities had been built around a trade, people who did not know what the next chapter of their lives looked like. They were there at a grief support group for young men, which was the kind of event that received almost no press coverage, but which William felt was among the most important things he did that year, because the silence around male grief was something he'd spent a decade trying to break open, and he was not going to stop now. That particular session, the Young Men's Grief Support Group, deserves to be described with care because it contained one of those moments that do not photograph well, but that changed things. The group met in a community center in South London. There were 12 young men, ranging in age from about 19 to 28. They had all lost someone close, a friend, a sibling, a parent. Several of them had lost friends to violence, and the particular quality of that grief, the sudden, senseless, often public nature of it, carried a weight that was difficult to explain to someone who had not experienced it. They had been meeting as a group for several months, but They were still at an early stage. Some of them were not sure why they were there. Some of them were only there because someone had convinced them to try, and they had not yet decided whether trying was worth it. William arrived without the usual accompaniment of what one of the group members later called the royal atmosphere. He was dressed simply. He sat in the circle rather than at the front. He did not give a speech. He introduced himself, just his name, the way everyone else did, and then he listened while others spoke. When the conversation turned to him, he spoke about his own grief. He spoke about his mother. He did not do this in the measured, carefully constructed way that public statements sometimes required. He spoke about it the way a person speaks about something that still hurts, even after a long time. He said that one of the hardest parts was that the world expected you to be finished with it at some point. That grief had a supposed endpoint, and if you were still carrying it years later, there was a pressure, never stated directly, but always present, that you were somehow doing it wrong. The room was very still when he said this. Then, one of the young men, a 23-year-old named Jerome, who had lost his older brother 18 months earlier, said, "That's exactly it." He said it quietly, not to the group, almost to himself. Then he looked at William and said it again, louder. "That's exactly it. Everyone thinks I should be over it. My mom, my girlfriend, everyone. Like there's a date on it." William looked at him. He said, "There isn't." Jerome nodded. And then he started talking, really talking for possibly the first time since his brother died, and he didn't stop for a long time. Catherine was not there for that session. She had been with a different group that day, across the city, doing work of her own. But when William returned home that evening and told her about Jerome, she was quiet for a moment and then said what she always said when he described these moments. Good. Not a big word. Not a complex response. Just good. Because good was what it was. The accumulation of these moments. The ones that were witnessed and the ones that were not. The ones that made the news and the ones that existed only in the memories of the people involved, was beginning to have an effect that was larger than any individual visit. Something was shifting in a national conversation. Not dramatically, not overnight, but perceptibly. People were beginning to talk more openly about grief, about loss, about the invisible weight that many people were carrying. Mental health organizations reported increased engagement. Community grief support groups saw their attendance rise. Conversations that had previously been confined to therapy rooms or whispered in private began appearing in more public spaces. It would be too simple and too generous to attribute all of this to William and Catherine. The shift had many causes, many contributors. But those who study the way cultural conversations change, how certain topics move from the private to the public, how permission is granted for people to speak about things they had previously felt they must hide, will tell you that visible role models matter enormously. When people in positions of prominence and visibility speak openly about grief, about pain, about the parts of human experience that are not comfortable or convenient, it sends a signal that these things are speakable, that they belong in the room, that having them does not make you weak or broken or less. William and Catherine were sending that signal continuously in every room they entered, and the signal was being received. There was a particular evening toward the end of that winter when the effects of everything they had been doing crystallized into a single image that would stay in people's minds for a long time. They had attended a memorial service, a formal occasion, held in a large church with significant attendance and the full weight of ceremony. The service was beautiful, in the way such services can be beautiful, with music and readings and the careful language of remembrance. And then, at the end, as people were moving slowly out of the church into the evening air, something happened that had not been planned and was not on any schedule. A woman at the back of the congregation, an older woman, unknown to them, who had come alone and sat alone throughout the service, had become overwhelmed. Not dramatically, not in the way that draws immediate attention. She was simply standing very still near a pillar, and her face had that particular expression of someone who is working very hard to hold themselves together and is not entirely certain they're going to succeed. She was not causing a scene. She was not asking for help. She was simply there in the ancient and solitary labor of grief in a crowd of hundreds of people, every one of whom was moving in some direction except her. Catherine saw her. She moved through the crowd without drawing attention, without signaling to anyone on her team, without the usual small choreography of a public engagement. She simply walked over to the woman and stood beside her. She put her hand on the woman's arm, lightly. The woman looked at her, and then, slowly, the held-together expression dissolved, and she began to cry. Not noisily, not in collapse, but in the careful, exhausted way of someone who has been not crying for too long. Catherine stood with her. William, who had noticed where Catherine had gone, made his way over quietly and stood on the woman's other side, not saying anything, just there. They stood there for several minutes. The crowd moved around them. No camera captured it, or if one did, it was never published. It existed only as a lived thing, witnessed by a few people nearby who understood immediately that they were seeing something that did not need to be described or analyzed. When the woman had steadied herself, she looked at them both and said something too quiet to be heard by anyone else. Whatever she said, Catherine smiled, a real smile, not a public one, and William nodded. And then they gently, carefully made sure she had someone with her before they moved on. That woman's name was never reported. Her story was never in a newspaper. She was not a dignitary or a public figure. She was simply a person who had come to a memorial service to mourn someone she had loved and who had for a few minutes in a cold churchyard been held by two people who could have been anywhere else and chose to be exactly there. This is what it means to comfort a mourning nation, not through policy or proclamation, not through the grand gestures that history records and textbooks repeat, but through the accumulation of small, true moments, a chair pulled close, a hand held, a silence shared, a story listened to, a person stood beside, through the refusal to look away, through the willingness to step into the cold and stay there. Britain had been cold that year, but in the rooms and halls and churchyards where William and Catherine had been, something warmer had been present. Not warmth that erased the grief. Nothing does that, but warmth that made it bearable. Warmth that said, this is hard, and it should be acknowledged as hard, and you do not have to carry it as though it is not. Warmth that made the grief, for those who received it, feel less like a sentence and more like a passage. Something with a beginning and somewhere far ahead, if not an end, then at least a continuation. A next thing, a mourning that would eventually come. They did not save the nation. They were not capable of that, and they never claimed to be, but they held something for it in a way that individuals can hold something for a large and abstract collective, by being specific, by being present, by being human in the fullest possible sense of that word. And in doing so, they reminded the nation of something it already knew but sometimes forgot. That grief shared is grief halved, that presence is its own form of power, and that the most profound thing one person can offer another is not a solution, but simply this: to come and to stay and to look them in the eyes without flinching for as long as that is needed. William and Catherine came. They stayed. They looked people in the eyes. And Britain, for it, was a little less alone.